there are 2 immigration programs in Canada that let you apply directly for permanent residency if you're able to find a job. And though these programs are similar, they are not the same. And you could be applying for one thinking that you're applying for the other when you may not be eligible for the other. It's very important that you know these differences to see whether you qualify for one or the other or both. And if you get through to one, you may end up in very different places in Canada. Today, we are going to explore the Atlantic Immigration Program and the Rural and Northern Immigration Pilot Program. Stay with me while we figure this out and stick to the end to see how you can get help if you need help for these programs. Okay, so here we're going to cover the basics, okay? The Atlantic Immigration Program is a permanent program. It started out as a pilot back in 2019, and then they made it a permanent program. So it exists and it will exist for as long as we know. The Rural and Northern Immigration Pilot Program, however, is a temporary program and is slated to end this year, 2024. Now, I suspect, and there's word in the streets, that they are going to extend it, but until the fat lady sings, we really don't know. So as far as we're concerned right now, this program, you need to have a community recommendation by February 2024, and you need to apply for permanent residency by August 2024. So that's the temporary nature of this pilot program. February is right around the corner, okay? Now, the Atlantic Immigration Program is employer driven. This means that the employers in a certain region of Canada are the ones that are saying, hey, we need help. We need to be able to hire people. Give us the permission. Whereas for the Rural and Northern Program, it is community driven. So there are certain communities spread out across Canada that have demands for a certain occupation or certain occupations. And so those communities are the ones that the people in the community come together and then send the request to the government to say, okay, this community needs help. We need these many healthcare people, these many this people, these many that people. And the community is the one that drives the needs in that community. Now, location-wise, for the Atlantic Immigration Program, you are going to be going to 4 provinces in Atlantic, the 4 provinces in Atlantic Canada. And just for your geography, that is the Newfoundland and Labrador, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick. Right? Whereas the Rural and Northern Program, these are going to be 11 communities that are spread out across multiple provinces in Canada. Now, you need to have a job offer from the Atlantic Immigration Program from a designated employer. These are the employers that have pre-approval from the government to say, okay, these employers, they're on a list, they can hire you once they're on the list. Whereas you need to have for the Rural and Northern Program, you need to have a job offer in the eligible community. So it's not necessarily to a specific employer. It is once it is in the community and the community endorses that employer. Now, neither of these programs require you to get an LMIA. Those are the perks, and that's why the Atlantic Immigration Program was one of my favorite programs back in 2019. No LMIA, okay? Now, the annual quota for people for the Atlantic Immigration Program is significantly greater than the Rural and Northern. We have about 6,500 people being like a mid-range. It could go as high as 9,000 people for the year of 2024 as the high range. And the quota for the Rural and Northern Program is pretty small for 2,750 people. And this is spread out across 11 communities. Now, like I said before, this program is a temporary program. You have to have a job and a recommendation by February 2024. And on some sites, it's saying February the 1st, 2024. Okay? Not February the 28th or 29th, 30th. Is this year a leap year? I think so. Anyways, have this recommendation and the job by February 2024 and must apply for your permanent residency by August 2024. So those are the basics. Now, a little bit more about the basics is that both of the programs are direct pathway to permanent residency. Once you get a job, what you're applying for is permanent residency, and then you get like a supplemental work permit to come and start working while your permanent residency application is processing. So once you get here, you're working and you're direct to PR, which is really good compared to like international students who really don't have a direct pathway to permanent residency. Direct guaranteed anyway. Now, like I said, you apply for your PR, you get the work permit, and that's the same for both of these programs. And the jobs that you can apply for in Atlantic Canada for the Atlantic Immigration Program are jobs from employers that are on the designated list, right? So an employer on the designated list could be hiring a cook, and that is okay for the Atlantic Immigration Program. Sometimes they put restrictions on certain occupations, like I've seen where they've like halted hiring in hospitality because they've probably have an overflow or a surge or too many people, or they've met the cap for what they think they should allot to that occupation. But for the most part, the jobs are relative to the designated employers. For the Rural and Northern Immigration Program, now each community is different, and I've seen where a lot of the communities are hiring in-demand occupations, right? So then it's going to be certain fields like healthcare, construction, hospitality. So it's going to be dependent on what the in-demand occupation is in that community, okay? Now, on a map, here's where the very big difference is relative to location in Canada, right? So this is all of Canada, and the Atlantic provinces are Eastern Canada. So those red provinces over here are your Eastern provinces: Newfoundland and Labrador, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. And if you are applying to the Atlantic Immigration Program, you will go somewhere over here. Now, if you are going to be targeting the Rural and Northern Program, these blue circles represent the participating communities across Canada, and across, like you can tell, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 provinces, with majority of them actually being in Ontario. And here's your beloved Toronto. If you are interested in Toronto, I put Toronto on the map just to give you an idea of referencing where Toronto is relative to everything else. So 11 communities and 4 provinces is where you would end up if you are targeting any of these 2 programs. Now, proof of funds look a little bit similar, but are not quite the same. Like we said, these programs are similar, but not the same. The Atlantic Immigration Program generally requires a little bit more for proof of funds, but the more is like $1,000 more Canadian dollars relative to like express entry, right? In express entry, you could just easily add a 10 to this for like 13,000, 14,000, 15,000, 16,000. If you are like an individual, it's definitely above 13,000, right? So this is significantly less than those programs, but comparing the two, the Rural and Northern requires less funds than the Atlantic Immigration. I don't know that there's any science as to why that is so. However, it's not terrible compared to other programs. So this is in Canadian dollars, and note that this is the amount you need to migrate, whether or not your family is coming to Canada with you or not. So if you are coming by yourself, but you have a wife, you need to take into account the number for 2 people for both of these programs. So this is whether or not your family is accompanying you or not. Okay, so this is our proof of funds for these 2 programs. Now, language test. The requirements are pretty similar in terms of the minimum score possible on the English or French test. Now, depending on your tier for the Atlantic Immigration Program, the higher the tier means that you need to get a slightly higher score. Only slightly, because like, remember we said 4 is like pass. So 5 is like just above pass. So tier 4 people can do the bare minimum pass, and then tier 0 to 3 can get 5. Whereas for the Rural and Northern, the tier 1 and tier 0 is a higher language score, so a 6. Tier 2 and 3 is a 5, and tier 4 and 5 is a 4. I put the table here just for you to be able to see real quick what that means. Like I said, 4, bare minimum, 5, scrape through, 6, you did kind of okay. So tier 0 and 1 is for the rural and northern program 4, 6, and then both of them will accept a 4 or a 5 on your language test. This don't mean you must score for the bare minimum, but if English isn't your first language, I understand where it's harder to get a higher score. So if you can just scrape through, you're in good standing. Now, the job offer is relative to your education requirements are also important. So education for each of these programs is slightly different, where in the Atlantic Immigration Program, you need at least a 1-year post-secondary credential. So this is like college or university. If you are in tier 0 or tier 1 job offer or category. Whereas the lower tiers 2, 3, or 4, a high school diploma is acceptable. And high school diploma, anything you do for immigration to prove that you have the language has to be supported by an education credential assessment for non-Canadian education. So once you went to school outside of Canada, you have to have an ECA from a company like WES, World Education Services, to prove that you have this 1-year post-secondary. That's why it says Canadian or equivalent. The equivalent would be supported by the ECA. So for the rural and northern immigration program, as long as you have high school or post-secondary, you can go through. So a little bit slightly less requirements over here. It's not super clear as to when you need high school or post-secondary, but this is going to be tied in to your tier for your job offer and meeting what is required of that tier based on your job offer. So a tier 0 is going to need post-secondary certificate. So they're both basically saying the same thing, but not fully. So we looked at the language test already. So now your work experience. Now they have similar requirements with regard to the work experience. However, you can see here where the difference in work experience for the Atlantic Immigration Program, 1 year in the last 5 years is good. Whereas rural and northern, 1 year in the last 3 years is what they want. It can be either hours gained from part-time or full-time jobs. And both of them need to be from non-seasonal employment. Now they have to be paid, and the self-employed hours do not count, which is, I feel like that's discrimination. But anyway, some self-employed people work probably a lot more hours and harder than full-time people. I'm just kidding. I'm just saying. So now with work experience, this is relative now to the job offer that you're getting. If you are getting a job offer in tier 0, 1, 2, or 3, the job offer needs to be at least a 1 year. So it can be like a contract position for the Atlantic Immigration Program. But if you are in tier 4, it has to be permanent employment with no end date. So this is relative to your job offer now and not your work experience. And then for the rural and northern program, your job offer has to be a permanent position with no end date. Which makes sense, right? Because they're trying to fill up those communities. They're not trying to keep it there for a year. It's interesting that Atlantic Immigration has this 1 year thing going on. This is super, super, super important and can be the difference maker between you applying for this job versus that job. Now, in the Atlantic Immigration Program, you can basically take a promotion, but you cannot be demoted. You cannot demote yourself. So what that means is that the job offer, if the job offer is a tier 0 position, and we know tier 0 is like managerial, very high up on the pyramid kind of positions. Tier 1 is probably more supervisory, but still kind of managerial, or professionals like doctors, architects, those licensed professionals, right? So if you are getting a tier 0 job offer, your work experience can be either 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, which means that somebody who is in a tier 4, who is probably a truck driver, could apply for a manager position. However, a manager cannot apply for a truck driver position. So if you're getting a truck driver job at tier 4, your work experience has to be from tier 4. It cannot be from a tier 0. So this is to prevent you from coming in to Atlantic Canada and working for a job that you are overqualified for. You can be underqualified, but not overqualified. So you can't go backwards. So this table is key to note when you are applying for jobs and looking for jobs. It's important that you pay attention to what category they are in so that you know whether you qualify or not. The rural and northern is a little bit more flexible and open. Tier 0 or 1 can be tier 0, 1, 2, or 3. Tier 2 or 3 can be tier 1, 2, 3, or 4. And tier 4 can be 2, 3, 4, or it can be somebody from tier 1 who has a work experience in tier 1 if they are from healthcare, the healthcare industry, applying for a tier 4 position. So a nurse can apply, or a senior registered nurse, if that's tier 1, can apply for a truck driver position if they're in healthcare, right? So they can go back a little bit here, and it's a little bit more flexible here, but not fully. It's pretty similar, with the exception of probably tier 4, yeah, right? And then as you can see, rural and northern goes to tier 5, but the Atlantic immigration stops at tier 4. So super important. Obviously, this one is a little bit more open. It's basically any job, anybody, anywhere. But it's important to note the experience. If you are applying for a tier 5 job, the experience has to match whatever the tier 5 knock code says, right? As if you're an international student who is in Canada studying in one of the Atlantic provinces or in one of the participating communities, you are exempt from showing the work experience requirement. So you're exempt from having to worry about any of this if you studied for 2 years minimum at a recognized post-secondary institution in Atlantic Canada for the Atlantic Immigration Program and in the recommending community for the Rural and Northern Immigration Program. Your studies had to have been full-time, and you would have had to be living in any of these areas for a minimum of 16 of the last 24 months, the last 2 years. Well, if you're going to school there, obviously you're going to be living there, duh. But don't be living like right outside the border and going to school inside, because it's cheaper to live outside the border. Live inside the border of that community, right? So know where the radius of the community starts and stops, okay? And of course, you've had to have legal status to be in Canada to study, and this applies for both. Now, for the rural and northern, let us say the studies is less than 2 years, but was a master's degree or a PhD. It also will qualify for being exempt from the work experience requirements. Now, as an international student, let us say you studied for 1 year. It doesn't mean that you're not eligible for these programs. It just means that you're not exempt from the work experience requirements. Okay, you can still apply. You can still show interest in it. Just meet the work experience requirements according to these tables, and you should be good. You're basically a federal skilled worker in that category versus an international student. But of course, you have perks because employers will say, oh, they went to school here. Canadian education. Now, there are some exceptions in the rural and northern program. So you know how we said, like, okay, you must study for a minimum of 2 years. Sometimes you would have gone to school for 2 years, but you did one program and another one. So you studied project management and then you went and studied supply chain management. That's called a 1+1 program. That does not count. Okay, that does not count for the exception that international students can show. Now, if the program was in English or French for more than half of the program, can't apply as an international student. If it was part of it was distance learning for more than 50% of the program, you can't apply as an international student. And if you are an international student who is on a scholarship that requires you to return to your home country and give back based on what you learned, you are not able to apply for this program as an international student. So that's good to know. Now, look out for any announcements that will come up in 2024 as to whether this program is going to be extended or not, or going to be made permanent. I believe it's going to be made permanent for a number of reasons. On the 2024-2026 levels chart, there is a quota for these pilot programs for every year going all the way to 2026. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean this program. It could mean that they are just an allotment for any pilot program that they want to introduce. So we will see how 2024 unfolds. The process. So here's the process for each of these programs, basically in a nutshell and step by step, and the differences between the two. Now, one, you have to get a job offer from a designated employer for the Atlantic Immigration. You have to get a job offer from a participating community within a participating community for the rural and northern by February of 2024. One thing that you want to do is to check the community requirements for the rural and northern program, because they're not the same. And that's one difference between the two programs. The requirements of you as a candidate is going to be relative to what that community asks for. Whereas the Atlantic Immigration Program, there is no special, not really anything special between the different provinces in terms of your eligibility. Once you meet the global standard Canadian immigration eligibility, you're good. This one here, you have to check the community, not for just the requirements, but also the application process could be different. So you want to check your eligibility, check the community requirements, get your job offer from a designated employer or within a participating community. In the Atlantic Immigration Program, you have to get a settlement plan from a settlement services provider. This is something that you're going to take and give to your employer. Then your employer is going to submit you as a candidate, the job offer and the settlement plan to the government to be endorsed. And then you will get an endorsement certificate from the employer. You will take that endorsement certificate with the job offer and you will apply for permanent residency. The endorsement is the responsibility of the employer. They will get it for you and give it to you. On the other hand, rural and northern, once you've gotten the job offer, you need to apply to the community for a recommendation, right? So you're dealing with two different bodies here, whereas here you're dealing with the job offer is from the employer, the recommendation is from the community. Over here, everything is the employer, right? So you're dealing with two different bodies here. Apply for the community recommendation, and then if the community recommends you, you can apply for permanent residency. And you need to be applying for that by August of 2024, unless things change. If things change, come back here to see if they've changed. Hint, hint, subscribe. Now, what are your next steps? One, check your eligibility. See which one of them you are more eligible for or are eligible for. Two, check your calendar. It is now early January, still almost mid-January, and you need to be paying attention to the dates, the expiration dates for the pilot program. If it is close to expiry and you're putting a lot of effort and energy into it and you can't get things done by February the 1st, you need to be shifting your focus to the Atlantic Immigration Program. Two, hunt for jobs. Make sure that you're applying to jobs with the right employers in the right areas and pay attention to the job postings to make sure that they are open to people who do not have legal Canadian status. Join my waitlist. I have a job list that is going to be launching this week, Thursday, January the 11th. Right now, there is an exclusive list of people who had already expressed interest. We have about 103 people who have already signed up to get access to this list. Now, they have early access, and then once they have had their access and had their time to mull over and figure out if they're going to do it, then you will have access to it. So join the wait list at the link that you can find wherever links are, you know, right? So that once the list is available to everybody else, you will get notified and you'll be able to access the job list. And this is going to be a job list of employers in Atlantic Canada. Why Atlantic Canada? It's a permanent program. Rural and northern, as far as we know, is going to expire. Even if they extend it until they say so, I'm not going to put effort into doing that. It's going to expire in 3 weeks, right? So right now, if I had to pick between the two programs, I really like the Atlantic Immigration Program because it's easier to target employers when there's a list of employers to work from. In the communities, you're really just looking in the community, seeing what the community has, and then applying within the community. So it's a great program just the same. But if I had to choose between the two, I'd be choosing the Atlantic Immigration Program. You have a lot more runway, a lot more people are able to apply to this program, right? Remember, 6,500 to 9,000 people versus 2,750 or whatever the number was, right? So I'm pro Atlantic Immigration Program. My job list is Atlantic Immigration Program focused. All 4 provinces right now, we have several jobs on the list in each of the provinces, and we're adding jobs daily. And this is the work that we are doing for you, so that you don't have to go through and figure out, is this a designated employer? Does this job qualify? This, that, and the devil knows what. So join the wait list. And if you need to check just to have a conversation, just to see if this is something that you should be going for, book a coaching call with me. My calendar is open on a Thursday between 10 and 12:30 p.m., 10 a.m., 12:30 p.m. for you to have a 20-minute chat with me. And everything that you need is down below. I had fun doing this comparative analysis. Now remember that this is for information only. It doesn't mean that you're eligible. You still need to check your individual eligibility, and this does not replace an immigration consultant advice. So I appreciate you and the time that you spend here with me on YouTube. If you're new here, please subscribe, hit the like button to help other people know that this was helpful or worthy of watching. And if it was helpful to you, hit the like button. Share it with anybody who you think it may be helpful to. I will see you in the next video. Bye.